thanks to the Ross McKee Foundation. And it's just so wonderful to see friends here and future friends. And I do hope we can all get together sometime in the not too distant future. Yeah, and these workshops are so valuable, and I've learned a lot from watching them, and it's just so important to connect this way while we're sheltering in place. So a little bit about my background. I grew up in Berkeley and played classical music, and from the age of 8, I studied with Sharon Mann, who really changed my life, and she was my most important teacher. She gave me a lot of Bach and guided my way forward. And after briefly being at the San Francisco Conservatory, I went to music school at the University of Michigan. And, you know, in preparing for today, I was thinking about how we think of our lives as in terms of our successes or achievements. But today I was thinking, well, in preparing, I was thinking, this is really about sort of a series of disappointments and crises that have guided me through life in a way. So when I went to music school at the University of Michigan, it was the usual sort of hallways with practice rooms with pianists practicing as loud and fast as they could. And just sort of that, you know, the Rachmaninoff piano concertos and the Liszt transcendental etudes. And it's all just that sort of loud and fast, and who can be louder and faster. And then the practice room, which is the sort of antiseptic cubicle and the little window where pianists would walk by and look sort of disapprovingly through the window as you practice. And, you know, and the funny thing was that last year I played a concert at the Detroit Institute of the Arts, and a pianist friend of mine gave me a practice room in Ann Arbor at the music building. And I went back to the exact same hallway, and I went to the same practice rooms. And it was, I just relived that whole experience of, you know, I was in there playing something very quietly, and it was just this like boom, boom. And that feeling of music as a sort of competitive athletic event, you know. And it took a long time to not feel insecure about that I wasn't that sort of pianist. But in college, it was kind of alienating. And I wanted to read poetry and study English literature, and couldn't really find my place in music. So I did, after graduating, I started writing music, book reviews, and then music reviews. And that was mainly for the East Bay Express and alternative weeklies. And the first music review I wrote, that was about 1985, was about the pianist Julian White, who was a really beloved Bay Area musician. And that was difficult because I wanted to be objective about his concert, but he was a beloved figure and everybody loved Julian White. So that took a while to learn how to write critically and objectively. But writing regular music reviews was a great education because I would always get the miniature scores from the library and really study the music in advance and think about these issues like, why is one orchestra struggling while the other orchestra is successful? Or how do you put a program together? Or how do you respond when a great musician is having an off night? And I wrote a lot about the early music movement, which was really thriving, and the first Berkeley Festival and Exhibition in the early years of that. And I mean, so much going on in the sort of, you know, 80s and 90s, and Kent Nagano and the Berkeley Symphony and the early years when he was first with the orchestra, and all the exciting work he was doing, and learning about Toru Takemitsu and Pierre Boulez. And So in some ways, the circuitous path was best for me in the long run, but I also envy musicians who have been single-minded from the beginning, who were really laser focused and practiced 9 hours a day without stopping and memorized all the Chopin etudes and so on. So I envy that, but also feel like this has given me a broader perspective, and also meeting composers and musicians in my radio show. And I started at KPFA in 1989 when Charles Amerkanian said, try out a radio show. So the first one I did was on Stravinsky historical recordings, and my father, I grew up with my father's collection of 78. So he had like the 1928 recording of The Rite of Spring with Stravinsky conducting, which sounds, nobody knows what's going on. And same with the first recording of L'Histoire de Soldat from 1932. And those musicians can't deal with those, the polyrhythms and everything that was going on in the score. So I find those early recordings to be really revealing, much more so in a way than the later kind of classic Columbia recordings that Stravinsky did. So I did a radio show and then just kept going. And those days at KPFA were really wonderful because there was a recording studio where, Richard Good would come and be at the piano and we talk about the last 3 Schubert sonatas. And it would just go on and on, like for, 3 hours. And we talk about, he'd say, here, listen to this from the early sketches, and then listen to how Schubert did it later on, and how this reminds me of this song from Die Winterreise, and it was just really, really amazing. And we also did one on the 3 late Beethoven sonatas, and Alfred Brendel came, and Ursula Oppens and Garrick Olson, and it was just, that's my favorite thing, is to talk to a pianist at the piano, have them play. So another thing that sort of was a crisis was when I went to the Clara Haskell competition in Switzerland. And that was right after I met my future husband, John Sanborn. So he came with me, and he actually started smoking then, because I was smoking and I was so nervous. And then he was like, then he started smoking, and we were just, and it was, the whole thing was as nerve-wracking as possible. And, you walk into the hall and the judges are like way, way in the background in the dark. So of course you have to prepare all the different rounds. You have to do your preliminary and then the secondary, and then you have to learn lots and lots and lots of repertoire, and like 3 Mozart concertos. And the judges sent me home after the preliminaries. I had to play a Scarlatti sonata, a Bach prelude and fugue, and a Brahms intermezzo. And, part of me thinks, how can you judge anything after listening for maybe 20 seconds? But then I think, well, we all do that. Like, we all put on a new CD and it's music we know really well. And we're like, no, that's like, if it's the Waldstein Sonata or something, you're like, they can't play those opening chords, or they're playing them too fast, or they're playing them too slow. So we all make judgments. I think we all make snap judgments. But that's another thing I learned from being a music critic is to really try to go deeper and learn more about musicians and about composers than one's first reaction. But so after I got home and recovered from the Clara Haskell competition, I really thought about my relationship with classical music, and that I didn't feel like I had anything special to say. And I still, of course, play that music and love to, there's nothing better than playing Schubert. And I just recorded a Bach invention for Soundbox. I was invited to do some recording for a February concert, and that is great. But this whole notion of not playing contemporary music, of sort of poo-pooing new music, is such a relatively recent phenomenon that if you think of even pianists we love, like Dino Lipatti, he played modern music. Horowitz played modern music. Arthur Schnabel was a composer. You think of Joseph Szigeti and Bela Bartok, or Stravinsky and Samuel Dushkin, and these great relationships between musicians and composers that, you know, nowadays I meet so many pianists who only want to play music from 200 years ago or more. So it sort of didn't make sense to me not to play new music. And the other reason I started to play new music, I mean, there are a couple reasons. One is that composers started asking me, and for instance, Larry Polanski was a great early advocate and said, you know, here's a music festival in Maine. Please play my music and Ruth Crawford Seeger and other composers. And that was really great. And he introduced me to a lot of wonderful 20th century composers. But the other thing is that what I learned from being a music critic is that when a pianist plays a Beethoven sonata, everyone in the audience is picking apart how that pianist is pedaling, how that pianist is navigating a trill. You know, you go to a concert of the Goldberg Variations and you get upset if the pianist takes certain repeats but doesn't take other repeats. I mean, it's all the attention is on the pianist. When you premiere a new piece, the attention is on the piece itself and not so much on the pianist, which I like so much better, and I feel like that's the way it should be. One example of a sort of symbiotic relationship between these various activities was how I met Terry Riley. So for the East Bay Express, I wrote about a performance at Mills College of his piece In C. And so I just, you know, got in touch with him and talked with him and asked about the history of In C and how he wrote it. And then soon after that, we did a radio show at KPFA, again in the performance studio, with John Cahill, the from the Velvet Underground. And he and Terry had recorded an album in the 70s, I think, called Church of Anthrax. So they were getting back together, and I had them in the performance studio. And at a certain point, you know, John Cahill has this incredible Welsh voice, and I brought a copy of Dylan Thomas poems, and I just, on the spur of the moment, I said, would you read some Dylan Thomas poems? Beautiful Welsh voice. He said, sure. And then I said to Terry Riley, would you improvise on the piano while he's reading Dylan Thomas? And Terry was like, okay. So that was, you know, things like that are just so wonderful. But then soon after that, I was putting together a festival for the 100th birthday of the great pioneering California composer Henry Cowell. And this was through Cal Performances. And it was this sort of sprawling 3-day event with 12 different pianists that I invited. And it was, in retrospect, way too much. And in some ways, a disaster, because I just said yes to everything. And like Meredith Monk was writing a 10-minute piece, and then she wrote a 40-minute piece. And like, you don't tell Meredith Monk, like, no. So I said, yeah, 40 minutes. So it was just like the concerts were just, you know, hours and hours and hours long. But I asked Terry Riley to write a piece for that concert in honor of Henry Cowell's 100th birthday. And then he wrote this wonderful 4-hand piece, Cinco de Mayo, which I played with Joe Cabrera. But anyway, so I mean, that got me thinking of doing projects thematically and having a sort of cohesive whole. And so that was commissions from Meredith Monk and Terry Riley and a number of other composers. So Yeah, so that was my first experience commissioning, and I loved doing it, and just um, loved feeling like part of the creation. Um, I mean, I could keep going, but it is. I guess I also want to mention that the other thing that's worked well is these sort of do-it-yourself projects. I mean, to have an idea and then think about how to do funding and places for the pianist to stay, and how to get the printed programs together, uh, and I also felt like there was more of a need for accessible and audience-friendly new music events in the Bay Area. So I founded the Garden of Memory Summer Solstice concert at the Chapel of the Chimes in Oakland, and curated a monthly concert series at the Old Berkeley Art Museum. Um, and so that's sort of what I've been doing in general.
It's amazing, Sarah. And you know, I love what you said about it's a series of crises. There's that fabulous quote, and I can't remember if it's Beckett even. I don't know who it is, but it's fail again, fail better.
Oh, that does sound like Samuel Beckett. Yeah,
Yeah, but it's the idea that growth comes from the challenges that it's not like you always
yeah,
know what the path is or you always know where it's going to turn out, but you can't resist just taking those steps.
yeah.
That's very exciting.
So it's so true. I mean, you yourself do so many different things so well, and I'd love to hear about that.
We'll have another workshop someday. But
Yeah,
I
no,
think that to me what's so wonderful is that you find the not only do you find the time to continue to play, but you find the way to continue to be inspired in these different facets of what a musical life looks like, because it's not just, oh, I really played that great and it was so satisfying, I learned this new piece or whatever, but just, facilitating a concert you're not involved in,
yeah,
bringing people together in ways that are unexpected. So
yeah,
it's such a gift to be able to um, create more music, create more of a environment where music can flourish, and the Bay Area is so great for that. So
yeah. The Bay Area is great for that, and also Lolly, we live in a very different world than the one in which you and I grew up in, and it's not that easy for pianists, and or I mean, not just pianists, of course, but musicians and composers. And I mean, we're all it's a hard it's a hard time, particularly now, but even without the pandemic,
yeah,
it's just not what it used to be in terms of an easy path to Carnegie Hall or to management or to any of the things that it used to be, that you did your job and you went to a conservatory and then you got out. I'm that 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 there was a
yeah,
way forward for musicians,
yes.
and that's not true anymore.
No, it's very
Not-
different, and I see that
yeah,
for orchestra. People who uh, go to the conservatory and assume,
yeah,
the sad thing has always been people go to the conservatory and assume they're going to be, a huge solo star, and then they have to make do with being in a violin section.
right.
Now they should be so lucky. The competition for every single orchestra seat
Yeah,
is huge, so different than it was even 30 years ago.
yeah,
It's just
and
different,
yeah.
and the expectations are different.
And also, it's funny because pianists think, oh, being a solo pianist is the sort of end all and be all. But in fact, it's such incredible training to accompany choruses and, do all that stuff that pianists think of as kind of grunt work. But you learn so much, and accompanying a singer and learning to breathe with a singer, and really learning to listen, and chamber music and like orchestra playing that really kicks your butt.
Yes,
and that where you have to come in and wait 26 measures and come in a chord and just on time, and it's hard.
It's really
And
hard.
when you're a pianist and you're used to like, oh, I'll just come in when I'll just play this part whenever, or like,
Right.
I mean, you get lazy in your way
Yeah.
of counting and thinking in a way that chamber music people do not.
That's right. And people specialize. That's something that I think a lot of people don't think about. Well, I'm a musician, I can just play anything. But, I think most musicians actually really do specialize in what they decide. There's only so much I can really be good at.
Yeah.
So it's unusual to have a musician who really has legitimately something to say in more than one kind of area of playing, I think.
Interesting. Yeah. Yeah. Um, the Meredith Monk, so Sky was asking about scores, and I'm sorry I don't have PDFs to, the fancy sort of PowerPoint system, but Meredith Monk, so it was this wonderful pianist, Narit Tillis, who lives in New York and worked with Meredith Monk early on in, first Meredith Monk ensemble. And so I commissioned the piece really for Narit to play. And so Narit actually did the score, which is hard to read.
There you go. That's good. Light's good.
But this is an example of like a piece where you have to either have a recording or work with a composer that's just basically a sketch, right?
Yeah.
And so that's that piece. And then here's when I was 17 and was at the conservatory. This is the first score of Tiny Gates that John Adams brought into my room, and it has all these funny, I don't know, it's just this like old, it has like sticky, like whiteout and stuff, things like that. And Sky, you were asking about, how composers notate, but this is Jerome Kitsky, who writes all the, he writes all the lines, the ledger lines himself. And this is all handwritten, but it's really kind of amazing. Anyway, it's always interesting to see the scores and what comes up and just, commissioning. We should, talk about commissioning, but, so from starting with the Cowell Festival, I just started doing sort of larger commissioning projects where I would come up with a theme and then think of composers to write for that project. So in 2001, I thought, well, it was the 100th birthday, again, of a great composer that I love, Ruth Crawford, also known as Ruth Crawford Seeger. And I wanted to really celebrate her 100th birthday. So I asked, I think it was 7 composers who were all women to write for that event. And among them was Pauline Oliveras. That was the first piece I commissioned from Pauline Oliveras, the first of 5. And I said, Pauline, I know you usually write, for improvised, like you write a sort of recipe for improvisation, but I really would like a notated score. And she said, okay. And she wrote it was the first notated score she had written since 1963. And so that was amazing. And she sent that, and somehow the original got lost. So I have to eventually scan that and send it to the Pauline Oliveras Foundation because it's the only copy of the score. But also in that project, it was a piece by Julia Wolf called Compassion. And it turned out, several of the pieces turned out to be sort of 9/11 pieces because we were living in New York, and that was right around the time of the concert was December 10th in Merkin Hall. And so these composers were writing, right up to that moment, but some of them ended up being sort of about that moment in time. Julia Wolf lived in downtown New York and had a couple of kids, and it was just incredibly traumatic. So she wrote this piece, Compassion, and it was, it's sort of a very, her usual sort of pounding, like almost aggressive, almost like a sonic assault. And it was a very difficult piece, I felt, to come across and convey to the audience. And so I didn't play it for a long time, and only in recent years. See, this is one amazing thing. When you commission a work, like this was 2001, and only recently, now like 2018 or so, it started to be played by younger pianists, Conrad Tao, Vicky Chow from Bang on a Can, Lisa Moore, Ju Ping Song, and all these pianists started playing it. And I don't know how that happens, like if one starts playing it and then the others hear it and start playing it, but Conrad Tao recorded it. So it's just really wonderful to sort of see the trajectory of a piece of music. Or China Gates, which was, you know, it was like a weird piece in 1977, and no one knew what to do with it for a long time. And then it just became a classic, and all these pianists have recorded it. And like, what's his name? The pianist who played it for the Van Cliburn competition, like started the Van Cliburn competition with it, who won, who was the gold medalist.
Wow.
I should have his name. But anyway, it's like interesting to see what, over the years, what can happen with a piece of music. But
I have a question for you. When you commission a piece, or when you first are presented with a piece no one's ever heard before, it must be so much a matter of trust that you're going to be able to find a kernel of truth in that piece, to that the whole enterprise is based on this assumption that you will succeed in finding the truth of that piece. And I'd be really curious to have you talk a little bit about that. And do you ever find like you don't, it doesn't, you can't find that thing, or you just don't like it? And do you have those moments of, now what do I do? I've got this piece and I just can't get a handle on it? Or
yeah, well, there have been a couple bad pieces. So there was, so for my project, A Sweeter Music, I mean, I can just say this, that like, so a friend said, Sarah, you have to promise me not to play that piece ever again.
do you ever have have you ever come to the point of saying, I'm not going to actually play it after you commission something? To just not play it at all?
It's difficult because that's, because in this case it's $5,000 and it's a lot of money. But yeah, that's an interesting question. I think you're right that it's up to us to make sense of the piece of music and figure it out. And like, I have a new piece by Frederick Rzewski, which is really thorny and dark, and but you have to make sense of it, don't you think? I mean, just like you do with a piece of classical music, you have to really figure it out and
Yeah,
come up with an interpretation.
that's
Yeah,
the challenge.
and do justice to it. Yeah,
Right, exactly.
it is hard. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. And then I'm a big believer in paying the composer really adequately for his or her work. And it drives me nuts when colleagues who I hear them approach a composer and say, well, could you write a piece? I don't really have money, but maybe I could get some later. But I mean, which of course it's always an issue. But I've for that I've written grants, or sometimes I'll say to a composer, like, I'll pay you in installments. So if I get $1,000 or $500, I'll send you sort of in installments over a period of time. And then there are people in the Bay Area who are really amazing and generous and have either family foundations or, just give to projects. There's Margaret Dorfman in Palo Alto, who commissioned Compassion from Julia Wolf for me. And I think for her wedding, she got William Walton to compose a piece for her wedding, and has composed, commissioned Steve Reich for the Kronos Quartet, and John Adams's El Dorado, and lots of great music over the years. So she's amazing, and people that you can go to for projects. And for A Sweeter Music, it was really interesting. I was in an email correspondence with this guy Robert Bilecki, and I had never met him, and we just wrote to each other about, like, oh, I just went to a Cecil Taylor concert and blah, 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 and, just went back and forth. And then I told him I was commissioning a piece from Frederick Shevsky, and he said, can I help? And I said, well, if you have $5,000, that's what I need to commission him. And he said, okay. And I had never met him. He flew out to San Francisco anyway, he gave me a check. So things, you never know. And it's always worth sort of asking.
And taking it seriously enough to know that it's worth not only paying that, but what that kind of significance and seriousness does for the composer, the player, the listener. Everybody feels invested.
Yes. And it's so true. I mean, it's, for a while I was sort of commissioning people who were friends and my age group or older, and well-known names. And then I just thought, get outside your comfort zone and think of composers that you don't like. Do research and listen a lot and look around, and and younger generation, like, who's the next generation of composers? And it's so important. And I find that a lot of younger composers really devalue themselves, and that the money conversation is really hard, and they're like, well, anything will do, like just a couple $100, whatever. And and you have to say, no, you really, let's really be professional about this, because sometimes those are the best pieces you're going to get too, So it's important to, talking about money is always difficult and awkward, but it has to be done.
Yeah.
So, yeah. Anyway.
And it's another aspect of the, that big picture of the different facets of your path, Sarah, that what you're doing is facilitating that world of composition in a way that doesn't devalue it. Because, if there are enough people like you who are willing to say, no, it has to be real.
Yeah.
It has to cost
something,
real, and it actually has to be something, again, that can be taken seriously, that the time involved is worth it for you as well as a composer.
Because all of us want to be valued for our work. Yeah. So, yeah.
It'd be fun to reflect on a collaboration with a composer that maybe was surprising and changed your perspective in some way. Can you think of something that really kind of came out of the blue and had some real meaning in a way you didn't expect?
Well, I think I think working with Pauline Oliveros was like that because I never improvised and never knew how to improvise and didn't grow up. I only read the notes on the page. And she was so supportive and encouraging to everyone that she worked with of like, just, give it a try and try this. And what about this? And why don't you just do it for 3 minutes and I'll sit here and listen and then like, yes, this worked and this didn't. And so that was really important to me. I mean, working with her, and then I did commission other scores which were more open. And for instance, there was a festival in Redwood Park in Oakland, Art in Nature, that this composer Laura Intera put together. And so Pauline wrote a piece about the redwood forest and listening to the sounds of the redwoods and then playing them back on the piano. And but I also always encourage like younger musicians, like students that I work with at the conservatory or anyone. I say, go out and listen to a lot of your peers and listen to what's out there and start getting to know these composers. And, there often is something surprising that you hear. And so one example for me was going to a new music concert in San Francisco, and it was all sort of okay. And then there was a piece by Danny Clay, and I was just blown away. And I thought, here's a really extraordinary voice, and that night I wrote an email to Danny Clay and I said, could I commission you? And that was one example where he was like, well, maybe, like a couple hundred, like he was at the beginning of his career, and I had to talk him up rather than down. but I mean, yeah. So it's just fascinating, and it's fascinating to get to know, to work with. I always want to work directly with composers, and that's challenging now. Like Regina Harris Bayaki, we just worked together over Zoom, which works, and that was a premiere yesterday with the Ross McKee Foundation piano break. And so it's always important. And some composers are, awful people, but write really beautiful music. And then some are really great people. Yeah, that's funny that way. Yeah. So. Oh, I can't hear you. You're muted.
I'm muted, sorry. Yeah. I was just gonna say, I'd love to invite anybody who has any questions to go ahead and either put them in chat or just unmute yourself and go ahead, Sky.
Sarah, can you say more about who we should be listening to and exploring right now, or people that you'd like to explore more? You've mentioned a couple names. Go with more.
Oh, interesting. I feel like turning that question back on you. Who are you listening to?
I've just gotten into this bind, and you can probably comment on this, that as I run into new composers, I like to just go on iTunes and listen to them. If you have a subscription to Spotify or Apple Music, it's convenient to be able to do that. But many of them are not recorded and are not on iTunes. And catching them early is useful. I'll have some names in a few minutes.
Yeah. I mean, there are some younger composers who have SoundCloud accounts, like Ida Shirazi and Rina Esmail, and are pretty good about putting their work on SoundCloud. Yeah, who both have a range of piano music, but also orchestra music and chamber music and so on. Sam Adams is a fine young composer. I think he's always doing really interesting things. Samuel Carl Adams, I guess. And Dylan Mattingly, who is local, who I loved the piece he wrote for the Berkeley Symphony. So yeah, lots of great people from here, certainly. Gabrielle Elena Frank. But I don't know. I mean, I guess it's hard to predict. I mean, I'm sure you knew people when you were really young that you thought would accomplish great things later on, and they didn't. And then some people took decades to kind of come into their own. So you never know.
Yeah, and I've got an associated question. So as you know, I studied at the conservatory for a year in 2015, 2016 in the TAC program, which is the Technology and Applied Composition program.
Uh-huh.
And I find that among that group, there are a few of these young composers. And I say that because the ones at the graduate level are around 28 or 30 years old, and the younger ones are around like 21, 22. There are a few here and there who are doing things that really seem interesting. And they aren't accomplished yet. They've studied. So, for instance, one of my friends from the program studied with Mason Bates and writes stuff that's a little Mason Bates-esque. But I don't know that Mason Bates is on the cutting edge either right now. I mean, he's very popular in writing a lot of things. So it's interesting to see them come up, and I have the same reaction, which is I don't know if this stuff is going to last or not.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, so much of it is sort of instinctive that we respond to, right? Don't you think so? Just like classical music or 20th century music. I mean, it's we just often have to go by our gut, I guess.
Right.
I don't know. Interesting question, though.
Yeah. Nick.
Sarah, I have a plug
Hi,
and then a question for you. And the plug is later this afternoon, Volti is interviewing Danny Clay, from
Great.
whom we've commissioned a piece that will be performed 2 weeks from this afternoon. You can go to voltisf.org.
voltisf.org.
And find the link to Danny Clay, who is a treat.
And
yeah. then the question. I was interested in your comment about how with new music, the concentration is more on the piece, whereas with classical pieces, it's more on the performer. That sounds true from an audience's point of view, but from a performer's point of view, as you approach the performance of a new piece, is there something qualitatively different about your act of performing than when you're playing a classical piece?
No, I don't think so.
Okay. You're not concentrating on the piece more than on your own performance? I don't know that the distinction means anything, but.
No, I mean, it's funny because now that I think about it, there are certain pieces of 20th century music like Stockhausen Klavierstück saying, which is about the performer. Like it's about the piece, but then it's about the sort of merit, the athletic endurance of the pianist. So that when we watch Pollini perform it, it's sort of about, can Pollini get through it, and can he, maneuver everything that piece takes, and it's just such a superhuman workout. So, but I don't play many pieces like that. But that's an interesting question. I mean, I guess that the emphasis is on the performer in the sense that the performer needs to, give a persuasive interpretation of the new piece. But I think still during a premiere, in the old days when you and I would go hear Kent Nagano with the Berkeley Symphony do premiere, Frank Zappa or something. And then it was really, I think it was more on Frank Zappa rather than like, how is the Berkeley Symphony doing this Mozart Symphony number 40 that we've heard 3 zillion times?
Yeah.
If that makes any sense. Yeah.
Yeah, it does. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Sarah.
Hey. Hi. Long time no see.
Interesting that you have sort of evolved into a sort of a public figure as a pianist in an organic kind of a way. You started out doing journalism, and so people know you in all sorts of different ways. Maybe in the way that Wagner was known as an essayist in his time as well as a composer.
Didn't know that. Yeah.
This nowadays is, when you talk about pianists sitting in their practice rooms intending just to be the best person who can play Schubert's sonata, that is the furthest thing from their minds on the one hand. So there's that kind of pianist.
What do you mean by that?
I don't think that they're thinking of a career that involves an impresario booking them at 14 concerts in the United States. That's how they think about their career. They do not think about it in terms of, I'm going to write reviews, I'm going to become a public figure, or like Paderewski becoming a statesman for Poland. This is not part of their worldview.
Right.
On the other hand, you have some pianists who have been taught that for branding purposes, they need a blog and they need to make themselves interesting. But that doesn't happen in the same organic way that it happened for you. And I just wonder if you have any thoughts about that.
Yeah.
Recently, there's been a lot of talk about, say, Igor Levit, who has taken the spotlight for a lot of things. He's also gotten a lot of criticism simply for the fact that he is as public and as outspoken as he is. And I just wondered.
Well, Igor Levit, I mean, for one thing, like, I'm sorry, but can you do like these concept albums that he does, like Life, you know, where you have this, like all this repertoire, not a single woman, not a single person, composer of color, like he just sort of, that bothers me. I think there's a difference between someone like Jeremy Denk writing a blog about being a pianist, being a touring pianist and his experience, and writing music reviews. And you think about someone like Virgil Thompson, who wanted to be taken seriously as a composer, but everybody thought of him primarily as a music critic for the Herald Tribune. And I think sometimes the world perceives you in a way that they need you most. Like if you're primarily thought of as the executive director of the Ross McKee Foundation, which people, like that's so great that you're doing such important, valuable work. But then where does being a composer fit in, or being a pianist fit in, or the other aspects of your life, that like there is a danger of being seen. I mean, for me, when I was a music critic, I felt there was a danger of being seen as a music critic rather than a pianist. And I think, for people like Kyle Gant, who, being a composer is the most important thing to him, and being treated seriously as a composer and having his works performed. But people only think of him as like the music critic of the Village Voice. So yeah, like what can they do? What can you do for me rather than what can I do for you?
Is there a sense in which time will tell? Like talking about composers, like it's what's going to shake out from this big batch of composers, which 5 names are we going to remember in 10 years, if not longer? And in the same sense, like who was that person, which is the aspect of that personality that is the most lasting, and does it depend on the choices, the choices to be, no, I'm going to promote myself with my blog, so is the blogging what becomes more important than the actual composing or the actual playing? Isn't it a matter of kind of how it shakes out over time?
Maybe so. What do you think, Nick?
Well, no, I think it matters in the moment. I think it matters who you are right now. Wagner isn't around nowadays to promote his his treatise on vegetarianism, for example. So it's kind of like none of that
Nobody
matters
cares.
now, but it was important in the moment.
Right, right.
Wagner wrote a treatise.
I have a question. I'm kind of curious. Here we are on the Amateur Music Network, and I'm an amateur musician, and I'm really interested to hear what you think, Sarah, about doing this kind of thing that you do from the perspective of an amateur. In my particular case, I am, living up in the mountains, and a lot of my music work is trying to do just a tiny bit of what Lalila does with this very, very small community of, of other amateur musicians, and get people playing, and as a way of thinking about anti-extremism and that type of thing, really trying to work at it from that perspective. But I'm really curious about what you're doing and how you could think about taking on some of that as an amateur, not as a professional.
Oh, interesting. I love that the root of the word amateur is love. I mean,
Yeah.
love what you do. And I have to also say just about amateur musicians that some of my favorite performances have been at places like the Berkeley Piano Club, where it's, women who are amateur musicians and just give like fantastic performances of something that is, touches you so much more deeply than some touring pianist can. I don't know. I think, tell me more about the work you're doing there.
Well, I just do, I do little string groups of people who maybe played in high school but haven't played since, and I do a little bit of group education type of thing, completely volunteer, where there's, because I work full time in a completely different field. But I'm really curious about doing more of this kind of thing. I love the idea. When I was back in college, at Oberlin College, I played new music for the composition students there, and it was one of my very, very, very favorite things to do. I loved it so much, and it's so funny. Hearing you talk today has really got me thinking about untangling the performance idea, the performance from the composition side of things, because I just love both things, but they're sort of tangled up for me as an amateur. And I think about what you could do, and some of the things I really want to work on here is that sense of place, and thinking about how might you get collaborations or commissions relating to place. Would be so interesting, and you really just got my brain going in a million different directions that way.
Good. Well, it sounds like you have people there that you enjoy working with and collaborating with.
Yeah, I think there are definitely great people here. I think the challenge I always have is it's very much people who are much lower, in terms of experience and sort of skill level. So
Yeah.
I'm always trying to think of ways, that's actually why I found out about Lali's organization, is I drive down to San Francisco and do things every so often just to have somebody to play with. Or I go back to Oberlin and, do their Baroque Institute or something. I mean, I have to travel to try to find people to play with. So I think I'm just thinking about different ways as an amateur, but trying to really promote amateur music here, because I think that's really the most accessible thing for most people. But doing something like a commission for amateur musicians would be so cool. I mean, it'd be fun to find somebody to do that. And you're really getting me thinking about the idea of having to really do that research and listen and learn who's out there that you could collaborate and work with on something like that.
Yeah.
Actually, Danny Clay would be great for that.
Ah, good to know. And we don't have to worry about putting people up. Well, once the pandemic's done, we're a wonderful place to visit.
Yeah.
And also, just I don't know if that's at all helpful, but my world is the choral world, and Chorus America has introduced me to an awful lot of people. They do a commissioning project every year, and various composers jump in to do work. And I'm speaking of you, Marty, because they write things for kids. They write things for amateurs. They write things that are accessible technically, hopefully really wonderful and challenging in other ways. But that's a source that you might consider using, and you're welcome to. I won't talk further, but you're welcome to ask me, and I can introduce you to a Chorus America person. It is singing, but there are a lot of really great composers that get that concept that you're talking about.
Oh, that's great.
Grace, did you have something?
Oh, I just wondered where in the mountains Marty is.
Oh, I am in Plumas County in
Plumas,
in
okay.
Quincy in Plumas
Okay.
County. Yeah.
Okay, thanks.
Well, I love ending on a note of celebration of the amateur, and and of course our goal is to restore the love of the love of music to the central position in what we all do, regardless of whether we're amateurs or professionals in our music lives. So so I'm grateful for that, Marty. And Sarah, do you have anything else to share with us today? Is this a good place to stop?
I think this is a good place to stop, but thank you so much.
Oh, it was
Thank you.
wonderful,
It's just wonderful to see
Thank
all of
you.
you and to talk with you, and thank you.
Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Thanks for coming, everybody. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you both.